Within a decade, Ireland could be self-sufficient in terms of its energy output through a process that has become known as fracking or hydraulic fracturing. That's the claim of Tamboran Resources, one of the international companies currently looking to move into North Leitrim to extract gas from shale rock hundreds of metres beneath the ground. Sounds good in theory, but fracking is not without its critics, nor does it have a squeaky clean record in countries where it's already underway. France, by the way, a country of nuclear power, has banned the process. Now, to explain their proposals for North Leitrim, I'm joined on the line from Canada now by the CEO of Tamboran Resources, Richard Moorman. And here in studio I have Dr. Aedin McLoughlin of Glenwood Research and Eddie Mitchell, a member of the Love Leitrim group. But first we'll go to Richard. Richard, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, perhaps you could outline exactly what fracking is, I mean, where you start and how it works.
Certainly. Well, to keep it as quick for everybody as possible, essentially we have to drill a well, much like a water well, but deeper, perhaps a kilometre deep in Ireland. In parts of the world, this can go 2 or 3 kilometres deep. And once the well is drilled down, in the case of shale gas, which is what hydraulic fracturing or fracking is used in, we'll often take the well horizontal and actually drill sideways for as much as a kilometre or 2. And what happens is once the well is set properly in the formation that we're after, the formation of rock that contains the gas, well, the gas is trapped in such tight rock there that the only way to release it is to actually crack the rock. And so to crack the rock, we inject high-pressure water, and usually with that there'll be a little bit of sand, and the sand is there to prop open the hairline cracks that are created, and that's why the sand grains are perfect for that. And then in some parts of the world, such as the United States, there's a wide range of chemicals that are used. Now, the chemicals that are used will amount to somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5%. In Ireland, of course, Tamboran is not intending to use any chemicals in our fracturing, but nonetheless, it is in parts of the world used. Now, the chemicals are used very specifically to reduce friction, to prevent biological contamination and corrosion prevention, things like that. None of those actually crack rock in any way.
So what you have is you have this pipe effectively going down to the ground vertically, then turning sideways. It's going into this shale rock, and then water at very high pressure is pushed in to fracture the rock. The gas escapes, is trapped, and comes to the surface. That's the theory.
That's right.
What happens to the water that is pushed down?
Yeah, the water that's pushed down has to be clean water, or in some cases in the United States, people will clean it on the fly by injecting a biocide with it. Of course, we'll be using clean water at surface, so that won't be necessary. But the high pressures are dependent on the depth of the rock. In our case, they'll be as high as you would use with a pressure washer. If you check the ratings on your pressure washer, you'll see you'll use 2,000 or 3,000 psi, pounds per square inch. That's the kind of pressure that we'll have to inject into the ground at.
What happens to the wastewater when it's finished in the ground?
Well, in our case, the water is going to be recovered. Approximately a quarter of it comes back. About 3/4 of it remains trapped by the weight of the rock above it, and so it's unable to come back. The quarter that does come back, we're going to simply reuse or clean and then recycle into the ground. So that's our practice. In parts of the United States, that's done as well, but in other parts of the United States, the rules are not as strict. And typically, companies simply dispose this water underground, which, in my opinion, is a reckless use of water, first of all, but secondly, has created some problems where you're putting too much water into a given area and it destabilizes the ground.
To find out what would happen to the landscape in North Leitrim were this ever to get to the point of production rather than simply exploration, I'm told there are pads of quite large pads for a cluster of wells. I mean, what are we talking about?
Well, right now, Tamboran's design calls for approximately a 2-hectare pad, about 6 acres.
Per pad.
They'll be very lightly graveled. The majority of the pad is given over to the room for the drilling rig to move around. And then parts of the pad are going to have tanks on them, the water tanks that you mentioned we'd have to recover the water in. And so those will have to be underneath those tanks, concreted, so as to prevent any contamination possible if a tank were to leak for some reason. So as a result, there's a little bit of concrete, but largely it's a graveled lease.
Is this in the production process that these pads have to remain, or once you find the stuff and you're pumping the gas, will it all be grassed over and sort of go back to nature, or what's the story?
Well, that's a good question. Once you're done drilling, and the drilling for the entire pad will take between 6 months and a year, depending on how many wells we might have. If you have 8 wells, we can do that in about 6 months now. And if you have 16, which would be the high end we envision, that could take a whole year on site. And again, so what would happen is as soon as that's done, then all the tanks can go away, all the water ponds, et cetera, go away. And so the pad site is cut in half down to 1 hectare, or about 3 acres. What remains behind, we're going to have compression facility to bring the gas up to pressure that we can move it around the country at. As you may know, of course, Ireland consumes a fair bit of gas, nearly 500 million cubic feet a day of gas, and uses 60% of that for electricity. So we have to get it up to pressure for transmission. And that will be encased in a barn, soundproofed, and so people won't be able to hear it or see it. You'll be down to that. Now, you wouldn't grass it over. You would leave the light gravel. Grass would represent a fire hazard, and so we just wouldn't do that.
What's the lifetime of the shale gas? We talking about production over 5 years, or over 10 years, or over a generation?
Typically, these wells will produce between 30 and 50 years. Now, they'll be in constant decline, kind of, if you could imagine a balloon that you held in your hand and blew up, and then gradually let it go out, then it would blow out slower and slower over time. But they will be economic and productive for up to 50 years.
And the gas, I mean, there's no guarantee that you'd sell it to us, is there? I mean, you could be selling it...
Well, I'm afraid that it's kind of a funny argument, because in order for the gas to be taken out of the ground and put into market, it will have to be brought into Irish pipelines. Mm-hmm. And so Bord Gas and other companies like that will take control of it at that point in time. There's no practical way for them to ship that back to Britain or something. So it's actually going to be sold to Irish customers. There's no way around that.
I mean, there are gas interconnectors. So in theory, it could be sold to the highest bidder anywhere on continental Europe.
Well, in theory, but you'd have to get it there. And right now, Ireland imports over 90% of its gas needs. Northern Ireland actually imports 100%. So, in other words, all the traffic is coming this way. Yeah. There would be no
are you saying that you would be price competitive and therefore would be very attractive for Bord Gáis? In fact, you couldn't get rid of it unless Bord Gáis decided to accommodate you, isn't that right? I mean, if they said we don't want it, it's cheaper to get it from the Urals, imported as we have been doing. The Russians have dropped the price dramatically, so we'll take it from them, thank you very much. You'd be stuck with production that you'd have nowhere to go with.
Well, it would basically be market priced, to your very point. If the Russian gas was, for some reason, to actually become affordable again, then what would happen is the price in Ireland would have to drop accordingly.
Jobs in the area in the early stages as you're exploring, and if you ever get to production, what sort of economic benefit in terms of jobs and money into the Irish economy?
Super. Well, by 2013 is when we hope to be drilling the first pilot wells to test the actual ability to crack the rock economically. We'll be looking to have some 50 people employed within the north of County Leitrim at that point in time. Similarly, on the other side of the border, of course, we'll have a similar pilot project going, but let's focus just on North Leitrim. So we'll have 50 there. As the project proceeds, with every well that is drilled, you have jobs created because people need to look after the wells in perpetuity. So we estimate by the year 2020 to have somewhere between 350 and 1,000 direct employees in North Leitrim, and those people will be employed for the next 35 years afterwards.
I presume that you don't have to pay a royalty on this energy that's being extracted.
No, there's no royalty. That's the Irish system, and that's fairly consistent with world policies, actually. Most people have a production sharing agreement or a tax system. What happens in Ireland, as you are well aware, of course, you have the 23% VAT. We, on top of that, have 25 to 40% corporation tax on our type of company because we're a resource provider. And so our estimates right now, and I don't want to say too far ahead because the government gets a full report on this in about 2 weeks, but the short story is right now we look at Ireland's take to be almost 50% of the gross revenue of the project.
OK, that's the project as outlined by Richard Moorman, who's going to stay on the line. He's the CEO of Tamron Resources, joining us very early in the morning from Canada. Dr. Aedin McLoughlin of Glenwood Research and Eddie Mitchell, a member of the Love Leitrim Group. You have questions or reservations, is that not so?
We
Aedin?
Certainly do, and thank you for having us here, Pat. First of all, I just want to say that we're not opposing Tamron as such, because they're just a company doing what their company does. But what we are totally against is the introduction of a huge multinational industry into Ireland that's unregulated, and it's proposing to take over hundreds of thousands of acres of the northwest, Northern Ireland and County Clare. A lot of the attention is being placed on Leitrim at the moment, but County Clare is also in the firing line, with a similar licence having been given to a company to explore the area there. And their proposal is to turn these areas into heavily industrialised zones. And this industry is dirty. It causes land, air and water pollution wherever it operates throughout the world. There are no good practice guidelines, and there's no specific regulations for hydraulic fracturing throughout Europe. And that is really a very, very important thing, that we cannot guarantee that this industry can operate and it will not cause environmental and other
We'll give Richard
damages.
a chance to reply in a while. But Eddie Mitchell of the Love Leitrim campaign group, what's your concern?
Well, we're a proactive group. We're pro-development. What we want to see is the development of sustainable jobs in Leitrim. We want to see the continuation of farming. We want to see tourism and manufacturing. And this.
Well, a 40-year job would be not a bad job to have. You know, if that's what the life of this field would be, that's as sustainable as many of the multinationals would turn out to be. 40 years. If you were told that tomorrow someone came into Leitrim had to be there for 40 years, you'd bite their arm off.
Well, I just want to explain what sustainable policy is. Sustainable development is development that satisfies today's needs without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their needs. That's Irish policy. That's European policy.
The concerns are that an area that is currently sylvan in the absolute sense of the word, it's wooded and there are lakes. Yeah. It's the heart of the waterways, if you like. That this would become a different kind of place.
Absolutely. We're talking about the industrialisation in North Leitrim, West Cavan and the southern part of Fermanagh of 300 square miles. And we're talking about 100 well pads, and each one taking 6 to 12 acres. Richard Moorman is talking about 6. They have talked about 12 as well. And that means one every mile or two throughout the land. And each one of those has access roads, drilling rigs, heavy machinery, thousands of vehicles, changing the land use. You can't have agriculture. There's not much point in creating other jobs when you're losing jobs in agriculture and tourism because of this industry, and totally changing the way of life of this part of Ireland. That's basically what we're talking about.
So although you acknowledge that it'd be great to have gas.
Well, it would, of course.
But the price of this in terms of the jobs that are going to be displaced to be replaced by other jobs, it's just not an equation you're interested in.
It's not an equation, because you're talking about a whole population. We're talking about 15,000 people living in this area, and every single one of those would be affected by this, whether it is the disruption of the roads, the air pollution caused by fumes, a high risk of contamination of surface water and groundwater because of this industry. It isn't regulated. The government here has not got a policy to support fracking at all. The EPA is just starting a study on this. We're waiting for a study from the US on this whole on the dangers of water contamination. Europe is also starting a study on the environmental consequences, and it would be totally mad to allow this industry to come into the country before we know actually what we're talking about. So we're talking about stop this now and let's wait until these studies are done and then have a look at it and see whether it's possible to do this sustainably.
Well, I suspect that, Eddie Mitchell, you don't want it at any price, do you?
No. I was delighted to hear about a gas project.
Yeah?
I mean,
if you could just go straight down and take gas, that'd be grand. It's the fracking you're worried about.
It's the fracking. And the more we find out about fracking is designed to move gas. It's designed to create gas migration in rock. And we're worried that this gas is going to come up through the sandstone that's above it, and we're worried that it's going to come up through fractures. There's a recent study after coming out in America in Pavilion that showed that fracking fluid is migrating into groundwater. So we're gone past the stage now where people are worried about hydraulic fracturing contaminating water. We know that happens.
Okay, Richard, do you want to reply to some of these? I mean, I've been looking at a Time magazine article from March 31st of last year, and I must say I'm reasonably au fait with the science of this, but it was terrifying what I read in the Time magazine article.
It can be very scary to a lot of people to understand industry, frankly, because it's complex machinery, complex processes. I don't pretend to understand how they make chips for computers or meat for my table either, and those all have their challenges. But when it comes to what's been raised here today, let's talk to a few things. We are looking at 100 well pads at most in the entire project, which is 2 countries. So 50 in North Leitrim. Each one of those at their largest will be 6 acres. So 50 times 6, we're looking at 300 acres of land consumption.
Sorry, may I just come in that at a public meeting, actually, Richard Moorman did talk about 12 acres and 16 wells in a pad of 12 acres.
Yes, and Aedin, you've received an email from me in the interim explaining that our designs have continued to evolve. And so from that standpoint, please don't quote information you know is no longer accurate. When it comes to 6 acres per well, per well pad, we're looking at 50 times that, so 300 whole acres out of an area representing approximately 400,000. So from that standpoint, this will hardly be an impact on the landscape.
Richard,
we're doing everything we can to remove the visuals, and that's fine.
We understand farming. We don't understand fracking.
Water contamination actually are quite funny because they're blown completely out of proportion. Today, 90% of the wells drilled in the United States, 90%, are being hydraulically fractured. This is the new world standard. 20-some thousand wells were drilled in over 20 states in the United States last year. Another 1,000 were drilled in Western Canada, where I live.
Richard, we have no problem with the statistics.
Hang on.
The incidence of water contamination is less than 1 in 1,000.
We don't know that. The studies are only starting.
Just to read from that Time magazine article, which has stayed with me, and I dug it out overnight. In 2010, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection issued 1,218 violations out of 1,944 inspected wells for offences ranging from littering, which is probably not that important, to spills on drill sites. Wells have blown out, explosions from methane contamination have destroyed homes, shale gas drilling is an industrial process, and the more wells that are drilled, the more often something will go wrong, and in a populated state like Pennsylvania, those accidents will be felt. Now, presumably in North Leitrim, well, in Ireland everything is felt, by the way, yes. Richard, no matter where it happens.
No, that's a superb comment. But again, as you point out, and this is typical of, I'm afraid, what happens in the opposition movement, they count a truck accident of a well that's going to a well site as related to oil and gas. And that is hardly the same thing. In terms of something that has occurred on a serious level, it is less
contamination of our lakes
1 in 1,000 times.
One of the other statements here, 1 million gallons, 3.8 million litres of toxic briny wastewater over the lifetime of an individual well may be produced. Now, I know you said you're talking about...
No, that's not true at all. That's not true at all. We put in the 1 million gallons. 90% of what's going to come back, which is 25%, comes back in the very first month. We're not injecting any chemicals. The rock underneath this project is unique, like every project in the world. So you can't assume that the worst project in the world is going to happen here. We've studied the rock. The composition is very favorable. There aren't going to be any toxic byproducts coming back. Salt is the worst thing we see coming back.
New York State has put a ban on fracking until it can be convinced that their groundwater would be safe. Now, they're pretty sophisticated and they've an awful lot of heavy industry in New York State already, yet they put a ban on fracking. Why?
Well, it's actually a moratorium. As you say, it's a temporary thing. Ban is the word strictly used for a permanent situation, and France has so far done that. New York actually has a full-time committee working to lift that moratorium, though, Pat. They, in fact, we've got very, very many people on there. Bobby Kennedy Jr., for example, noted environmental lawyer, is on that committee trying to find the right rules for New York to lift it. They expect to lift it early this year.
Pat, can I talk about farming for a second?
You can, of course.
We know that there's contamination of groundwater, and we know that's associated with hydraulic fracturing. If there's contamination of water, then there's a very good chance, and you're talking about a vast area to be controlled, that there'll be contamination of a sheep or cattle. If we have contamination of sheep and cattle, then we're going to do serious damage to our agricultural industry. Our agricultural industry was worth $8 billion last year, and it increased this year by 14%. Why would we put that at risk for a $6 billion project over 20 years?
Yeah, you see, reading your own figures, Richard, $8 billion is the estimate to the value to the Irish economy over the lifetime of this project. $8 billion a year is the value of our agriculture in 1 year. So if there's any possible threat at all to the idea of Ireland as a place for producing clean food, even if your operation is perfectly safe, the precautionary principle would say, from the economy's point of view, better not do this. What do you say, Richard?
Well, it's a fair statement. However, again, you've got to put it in context. I know it's new to people in Ireland to hear about this, but in Western Canada, for example, Alberta, the province I live in, Western Canada, and Saskatchewan right next door are huge agribusiness areas for Western Canada. We make a lot of money out of agribusiness, and it coexists right now with almost 1 million oil and gas wells. So it is not practical for someone to claim.
Richard, why did the French ban fracking? Why did the French farmers ban fracking?
Being hit with something in any part of the world, that we should stop something. In this particular case, we're not going to have any water contamination failures.
We can't say that. You can't say that when the regulations are not in place and self-regulation does not work. We've already found that in Ireland. We've had a building industry without regulation. We saw what happened. Banking regulation. And really and truly, now we're going into a situation where we have a third industry with no regulation.
I know this is going to be a debate that will continue, and I have a statement from the Department of Communications, but we'll get last words from you, Richard, to make your case.
Well, I appreciate the chance to be on the program. The main thing missing from the debate we find in the opposition is perspective. None of these people have actually seen an operation. Most of them have watched an American film called Gasland and are taking all of their advice from a movie. From our point of view, you do things operationally properly. You respect the fact that 5 million wells have been drilled worldwide. You respect the fact that 1 million have been hydraulically fractured, and that this could literally bring thousands of jobs to Western Ireland.
Last words then from you, Angela. Or Aedin, rather.
Right. I just want to say that this is a national issue. It's not just a local issue. It uses huge amounts of water, huge amounts of toxic wastewater is produced. There's a risk of contamination of the Shannon, which is which is proposed to be a source of drinking water for Dublin. There's a risk to our agricultural industry if contaminants get into the food chain. And, of course, fracking and ecotourism just are not compatible.
Eddie?
We want to see public participation in decision making. We want the EPA to carry out life cycle analysis of hydraulic fracturing to include the effects on human health. We want Pat Rabbitte to stop the exploration at the next stage. we want a moratorium in place until all the studies are completed, and then after a debate in Ireland, we want to ban fracking.
All right. Well, we requested a statement from the Department of Communications, Energy and Natural Resources. This is what they say. In February 2011, onshore licence options were granted to 3 companies over parts of the Lough Allen and Clare basins. The licensing options were for a 2-year period from March 2011 to the end of February 2013. The purpose of the licensing options is to allow the companies assess the natural gas potential of the acreage, largely based on studies of existing data from previous petroleum exploration activity. This work is largely office/desktop based and does not involve exploration drilling or hydraulic fracturing. By the end of the option period in Feb 2013, the companies will have to decide whether to apply for a follow-on exploration licence or relinquish the acreage. In the event that any of the companies involved decide to apply for an exploration licence that proposes hydraulic fracturing, the application would have to be set out in detail and be supported by an environmental impact statement. The application would then be the subject of an environmental impact assessment, which would include a public consultation phase. The environmental impact assessment would be broad and consider a range of potential impacts. The Department would also consult with other relevant statutory authorities such as the Environmental Protection Authority, the National Parks and Wildlife Service and local authorities before reaching any decision. Working under these licensing options is at an early stage, and it's too soon to conclude whether or not these authorisations will proceed to the exploration licence stage. So that's where we're at. In other words, the debate begins.
Thanks very much.
My thanks to Dr. Aedin McLoughlin, to Eddie Mitchell, and on the phone to Richard Moorman, CEO of Tamron Resources.